Good afternoon, audience, please. Could you sit down, and then we can start this awarding session. Okay. I'm Luciana Togero. I am a member of the board of the Brazilian Society for Ecological Economics, and I'm also a member of the Boarding Award Committee. The Boarding Award Committee members are Richard Nogard, the chair of the committee, Paulo Antunes from Portugal, Karen Limburg from the United States, Brian Walker from Australia, and myself. Unfortunately, Richard Nogard could not come to ISEE, and they gave me this honor to chair this awarding section. I'm very happy with this mission. Just to give you an idea of the constitution of this committee was nominated by the ISEE board to indicate laureates for the 2010 Kenneth Boulding Award, but the board have extended our mandate and left us with the honor another year. So we chose nominees for the Kenneth Boulding of ISEE 2012. An idea of the Kenneth Boulding Award and the Kenneth Boulding in person. You have a short bio in your program book, but I emphasize these qualities of his biography, the reason why he is the name of the main prize that ISEE gives each biennial conference. Kenneth Boulding was a system thinker who saw the social science, people and society intimately connected to morality and the natural world, an eccentric critic who was such a humble, creative, constructive, and productive scholar that he garnered the respect of all and was elected as a spokesperson, a model for both American economics and science as a whole, as well as for international peace. He lived, as he argued, the best he could in a world divided. This award is presented biennially to an individual or individuals who has contributed original and seminal approaches that have furthered our understanding of the interfaces between the social, ecological, ethical, economic, and political dimensions of our world. In the past, this award has been given primarily in recognition of achievements within the domain of the ecological economics. Our previous award holders are Robert Goodland and Herman Daly, 1994, Anne-Marie Jansson, 1996, Robert Constance, 1998, Crawford Stalling Hawley, 2000, Robert Iris, 2002, Carl Goran Mahler and Partha Dasgupta, 2004, Richard Nogard, 2006, Manfred Max Neef and Charles Perrins, 2008, Juan Martinez Allier and Inacy Sachs, 2010, who honored us with his presence at ISEE 2012, and based on criteria such as brilliant breakthrough thinking, engagement in ecological economics, and building its institutions, the Boulding Award Committee has unanimously agreed to giving the Boulding Award 2012 to William Rees and Matisse Wackernagle. A joint award. Congratulations. For the development, this joint award for the development, promotion, and implementation around the world and in diverse contexts of the ecological footprint, the most influential indicator of sustainability devised to date. We had many excellent, I have to say that the committee had many excellent, outstanding candidates, including some new nominations solicited from the membership, but in the end, we agreed that this was the year for the ecological footprint and all of the work that has gone into its development and promotion. From the Wikipedia, a small extract about the ecological footprint. Of course, they may provide us some secrets about the origins of the ecological footprint, but according to Wikipedia, the first academic publication about the ecological footprint was by William Rees in 1992. The ecological footprint concept and calculation method was developed as the PhD dissertation of Matisse Wackernagle. I'm just trying. Under Rees' supervision at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, from 1990 to 1994. Rees has also contributed for the establishment of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. He's a past president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. Wackernagle is current president of Global Footprint Network. And I was astonished with a personal information, a curricular information that you have lectured at more than 100 universities. I have been all my life teaching in just one university, so lecturing at more than 100 universities. So it's a very impressive biography they both have, and they have already received other awards. I'm sure that you are conscious about that, but I will give all the time here to listen to them, the laureates of the Kenneth Bode Award ISEE 2002. I give the floor to, I think first to Matisse Wackernagle to start his speech.
It's an enormous honor and privilege to stand in front of you, and a great pleasure to be with you. We consider you part of our family, where we grew out from. When I told my son that we would be getting the Balding Award, he was not surprised at all. He looked at my thinning hair. Said, okay, I understand. But really what we stand on is an amazing group of people. I think when Margaret Mead talked about the small groups that changed the world, probably she had ecological economics in mind. I wish ecological economics would be much bigger, because bigger groups can change the world even faster. And we need to get bigger, and I'm glad you're here. We have amazing people to be inspired by. I mean, Herman Daly, such a clear thinker, and I'm getting a bit scared about him in the way that he was so clear and people haven't listened to him. It's really scary in some ways to say, wow, so much clarity so early on, such a gentle being, such a warm person, and still such a long way to go. People who have inspired us who could not be here for different reasons. I mean, for example, Eleanor Ostrom, you know, still with us in spirit, and then people like Charlie Hall, for example, inspiring us in many ways, or Van der Falcone, who has become the foreign minister of Ecuador at one point, now the planning ministry, student of another inspiring person, Juan Martinez Allier, for example. We have amazing people, Hazel Henderson, and then also the younger generation here, for example, we have Sigrid Stagels sitting here, who I was at the meeting with at OECD, we talked about growth. The head of OECD was there, and she just said, it was becoming obvious growth doesn't work anymore. So she just asked him, so why is OECD promoting economic growth if we all know it doesn't work? And he said, because at G20, if I don't talk about growth, they don't listen to us. So thank you for being so courageous and just telling what it is. And then Bill Rees, obviously I spent 4 years under and with him. It was a fabulous time, so having him as a friend is a great privilege. I wish any PhD students would have the opportunity to work so closely with their PhD advisor, and we had just a fabulous 4 years to just kind of chat at each other and kind of come up with crazy ideas, and some stuck. And then the even younger people, somebody who actually cannot be here right now because it's another session, Kyle Gracie, who works with me, works with us with the elders group. So there's the younger generation that comes, amazing people, and some of the younger people here. I mean, it's actually what people said, it's amazing the distribution here. Lots of people with white hair and a lot of people very young. And so it's great to see that bridge building. And even younger people, and I mentioned just one who you probably haven't heard of yet. She's a 5th grader. She's called Nicola van Moon. Because I came to talk about the ecological footprint in their class, and I said, so how would you measure nature? She'd never heard of the footprint before. She said, square kilometers. Took me a long time to find that out myself. And so I said, so why would you need to measure nature? She said, so we know how much we have and how much we use. I said, oh, wow. So why would you need to know that? And she said, 5th grade, huh? 5th grade. And she said, because if we use more than what we have, the only thing we have is imaginary cookies. So, wow, that's pretty cool. But actually, that's why I start here. That's our report. I still have a few copies left. The simple question, I think, which actually I think we can probably give Herman Daly credit for kind of putting out and saying, just what happens when an infinite growth economy runs into a finite planet? And it's not just the imaginary cookies that are lacking. Do you want another one? Should I stand here? Okay. It's not just the imaginary cookies, but one effect may be that debt boils over. As we run out of resources, they get more expensive, economies have a more difficult time, and that's what I will be talking about. It's a wild statement. Majorities left out. I think that's what we see very dramatically around the world, and more so in the last years. Biodiversity is for sale. Are trees more expensive standing, or more valuable standing, or cut down? And then ultimately, does food become a luxury? And that's what Herman Daly probably already saw early on, and that's what I would like to talk about a little bit. In this lecture right now, a distinction, a new world. In 1992, I think we were still kind of not fully in an empty world, but I think we didn't feel the squeeze yet. We talked about the next generation, and it was a generation ago. It's now you, it's us, it's a generation later. Now we are in a full world, but what does that mean economically? And it's pretty simple. I think in the past, we would call it the factory world. In the factory world, the more you want, the more factories produce. So demand is driving supply. You want 2 iPods and 2 iPads and 2 iPhones, and they produce 2 because you want that. In a full world, the dynamics change because we all want a limited stock. So it shifts into a new dynamics, which we call the global auction. And that's a very generous interpretation of the word, because the auction is not a fair auction. Some of the contracts are already made for resources. Some of the countries who have resources and things get scarce will not participate in the global auctions as things get tight, as we have seen, for example, with the rice and the misharvest of wheat in Russia, where Russia decided not to export anymore their own wheat. So in a tight situation, the auction gets even more restricted. And as you may know, some countries have bigger armies than others. Also an effect on the global auction. So in the most generous sense, it's a global auction. And what changes in a global auction is everything. And that's what I'm going to talk about. But how do we know that we are in a full world? That's why Bill, and I think we were inspired actually by the Brundtland Commission to some extent, how sustainable development became a world concept. At the same time, we forgot that the key topic. I just had the opportunity to actually talk with Maurice Strong 2 days ago, and he said, what was the line, the byline of Stockholm? Only one Earth. And we somehow forgot that in the last 40 years. So how can we make that measurable? And that's where the footprint comes into play, to say how many planets do we have? That's kind of the easier part. They knew that 40 years ago. And then the other one was to say, how many do we use? How much does it take to produce everything that we consume and to absorb the waste? We compete for the surface. We are people and animals. We compete for surface to provide all the services we want, including space for our houses and absorb the waste and everything. And so we can find out how big is our farm. That's our biocapacity. How much do we use? That's our footprint. Now, when we look at the world situation in my life, I was born in '62. I will turn 50 this year. That's just 50 years, a very short time, I find. If you're young, you think that's a long time, but it's actually a very short time. That's how it looks like over my lifetime. And you see a number of things from this graph that we have moved from using quite a bit more than half a planet when I was born to now more than 1.5 planets. And that's possible because, like with money, you can spend more than what you earn. It just takes more time to regenerate than what it takes to use things up. We see that carbon is a very big part, a very quickly driving part. But it's not just a carbon problem, because of carbon, we are able to squeeze much more stuff out of the remaining pieces by intensifying agriculture, by accessing stuff further away, etc. So this fossil fuel situation has allowed us to squeeze the other one down. Also, using fossil fuel is a very unique moment. If you make a graph over the last 2,000 years, the fossil fuel age is very short, whether we like it or not. So so the sequestration of CO2 is about the same process as producing biomass. So is there enough biomass around to replace the fossil fuel? Should that be necessary? We see it's getting significantly tight. Now, when we interpret this graph, computer, an emotionless computer, just a brain, thinking, what would I say? Clearly, there are two things we need to do. They both start with S. We need to shrink, and we need to share, because not everybody has enough. Now, the other reality. These are the two most difficult concepts for politicians to take on. If you want to commit political suicide, talk about shrinking. And if you want to totally kill yourself off, talk about sharing. So politicians stand in this very difficult choice between political suicide or long-term ecological suicide. And guess what they choose? And so it's not to blame them. It's just a way that's the way it's framed. So how can we look at the problem totally differently to make it possibly solvable? And that's what I would like to suggest. The same information shown in a different way. If we frame it as not as saying, wow, we have a global problem, but rather to say we have a global hurricane. It's a global hurricane. But we are in boats in some ways. And we share boats, we talk to each other, but nevertheless we are on a boat. My boat may be called Oakland, where I live, the city of Oakland. If Oakland has a hole, why should Oakland wait for everybody else to agree first to fix their own boat? Why doesn't Oakland fix themselves? Because the other boats have holes as well. They may not come and rescue you. And when you look at the world of the last 50 years, when we see how countries have changed, now about 80% of the world population live in countries that have significantly less regenerative capacity available or biocapacity available than what it takes for them to consume. That means more people live in countries that are no farms anymore. They're hobby farms. They have perhaps a few chickens and a few kind of apples for the weekend, but for the rest of the week you need to go out and work and earn money to buy it. But from where? If everybody else is a hobby farm. So that means we're in a totally new world. And what does that new world mean? It means that if we are in a boat and we have a hole, and we realize that we have a hole, again, why do we need to come to Rio to agree first that the others need to fix their boat first? So we have huge opportunities to act. Of course it would be easier through global collaboration. I'm not denying that. But waiting for global consensus means wasting your future. Now let's look at Italy. Italy used about 1.5 Italys back in 1960, or even a little bit more. And by now they use about 4. What do I mean by that? See, this is how much Italy there is per person. This is how much they use. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 Italys being used by Italy. Is that a problem? that they have a biocapacity deficit. So when you look at how it's composed, we can see a big part of it is fossil fuel. They have to buy that fossil fuel from somewhere else. They still don't pay anything for emissions, but this is a cost to them. They also use a lot of cropland and other kind of land and fisheries from other places, so that's a deficit. Is it a problem to them? Actually, at the beginning, it didn't seem to be a problem for them because resource costs were going down more rapidly than the amount of resources they needed. And suddenly in the year 2000, that's shifted. Demand is going up and costs are going up. So we multiply these things. We multiply the amount of resources they need to get from some other places. We multiply that with the prices they have to pay for getting these resources. And when you multiply it, what we get is a cost curve. And we see that the cost for Italy, they stayed pretty flat in the 90s because prices were going down even though resource demand goes up. And now both multiply. And so the price of the resources they need to get from other places are significantly increasing. You think it's a small percentage of the overall GDP, but actually the increase is so rapid you cannot outgrow it. If you look at the percentage points of increase of costs to get the same stuff, it's like a downward escalator going down very, very quickly, and the Italians cannot run up again. When we look at Europe as a whole and say, so what does that mean for European countries? Because they seem to be in trouble. You have heard about the euro crisis? I'm not sure, but they talk a lot about it over there. Here, you see a lot of countries. What you see first is that every country is in a different boat. The dynamics for every country are quite different. Don't think we are in one big boat or one slippery slope for everybody. No, every country is in a distinct situation. But we still see some similarities. There are 4 countries that have very similar trends. Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece had a rapid expansion of their deficit, and all are drowned by their costs. Of course, first, we cover these costs by going into deficit spending, easy deficit spending, but one day, the boat breaks. And so that's what we see. So resource issues are not so much about the future. They're hitting us now. They're hitting us in the Arab Spring up till the Greek fall. Let me now summarize the argument in a simple diagram, because I think most people still think, and I think there's some truth to it, that in the end, income really helps us to solve problems. If you have more income, you can do whatever you want to do. So people want to see is income going up. At the same time, we want to see, do we have the resources to do that? So we graph that here in terms of, do countries still have a biocapacity reserve? Do they have more biocapacity than what they use? Or are they moving towards a deficit? So when we look at these 2 graphs and see how have countries moved over the last 25 years, this is what we see. And just to give you a reference point, in the world we have now about 1.8 hectares of ecologically productive space per person. That's the budget we have available in the world. That's how much exists in the world per person today. And some say we should leave for other species because we're only one species. Apparently we carry about 10,000 species in our bodies, like microbes, but there are 10 million species out there that are in competition for space. So what we see in this graph is a very rapid increase of income. At the same time, countries seem to be moving towards the left. What does that mean? And I will give you 3 totally distinct interpretations. The first interpretation would be to say, clearly, what you can see here is the more rapidly you use up your resources, the richer you get. The best strategy to get financially rich is to use up your resources. Proof made. Others say, actually, as we get richer, that we use up our resources is a sad side product. We truly do cry on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We give some money to WWF and other organizations, but from Monday to Friday again, that's what we need to do. It's a sad story, but that's the fact of life. And then there's a third group of people that says, possibly, if we don't have fuel anymore, the train doesn't run. That's a wild idea. Who is right? Now, each of the 3 groups, they have their own radio shows, they have their own academic journals, they have their own universities even. They have everything on their own. They live in 3 parallel worlds. Now, what we would say is that perhaps the frame is not correct. That's all framed from the perspective of a factory world, the idea that we can produce more and more, that absolute income really matters. But actually, if it's really true that we want more and more from the world, we are already in overshoot, we are in a global auction. We are in a competition over a limited pot. And even in a perfect competition without armies and without pre-contracts and with all fair play, if I earn twice as much next year, but you all earn 4 times more, I will still get a smaller share. So what we need to track is relative income. So here is the same graph using relative income. It's also World Bank data, nothing new cooked up. Just looking at how much does, for example, the French person win from the total pie of the globe. What's their share? And of course, the world average goes down as well because more and more people. So as you have more and more people, there's more and more people competing for the same pie. Makes it more difficult to get a bigger and bigger share of the same pie. So this is all driving everything. So this is the graph. One country goes a little bit in a different direction. Germany here, they have reduced their deficit, still at a very high level. But you see the overarching trend. Let me show you also a little bit more of Latin America or ecological creditor countries. So also losing relative income, not so important for them perhaps at the moment because they still have the resources. But basically they have wasted enormous advantages very rapidly without putting themselves in a stronger position. Again, 2 hectares, remember, or 1.8 is what we have per person in the world. And look at Australia losing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 hectares per person in 25 years. And what has been the benefit? So what we have is what in America is called double whammy. Have you heard that? Double whammy? It means 2 problems at the same time. It means on the one hand we have less and less resources available, and on the other hand our ability to compete to get the resources is vanishing. And it's actually a triple whammy because it happens everywhere at the same time. So it weakens us structurally. And that's why I believe when you look at the euro crisis, Italy, Spain, or Greece will not be able to get out of their hole, and neither does Egypt, without turning around the resource trends, which is a multiplication of the famous iPad formula. How much do you consume? How many people are there? How efficient are we producing things? Does it all add up? So you can basically find out what are the factors that drive it. And it's different for each country, but it's a significant factor. So that's the conversation we bring to countries. And we don't start with saying, you have to change your dream. I wish I could say that. But we just say, okay, if you really want to fulfill your dream, are you choosing the most successful path? If you really want just to grow your economy, are you really successful in doing that? Or are you digging yourself into a bigger and bigger hole? And these are the countries where we have done some early studies already to say, okay, are the numbers that we are cooking up close to what you would cook up? Or is it just totally kind of imaginary? And the French, for example, they reproduced our calculations and could reproduce them within 1 to 3 percentage points. At the end, they still made the recommendation and said, we shouldn't use the footprint because sustainability is much more complex. So, okay. Good for you. So what's the advantage of Cameron not knowing how many UKs it takes to support the UK, how many it took 10 years ago? It's like going into an airplane and saying, I don't want to have a fuel gauge. Would you ever get into a plane that doesn't have a fuel gauge? Airplanes are grounded if they don't have fuel gauges. Pilots are not allowed to fly if they refuse to look at the fuel gauge. I would take that wisdom into public policy as well. So here, the question to you. Our goal was in 2005 to have 10 countries by 2015 to adopt the footprint institutionally. We're very close. There are about 7 countries that have some institutional arrangements, more that have mentioned the footprint in official statistics, lots of UN agencies. We've worked with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on the footprint. So it's slowly on track. Now we see actually we have to speed it up. We have to get deeper, not just institutionalized. They have to use it for their competitiveness work. And that's why I'm also here to seek collaborations with you, because without you, we cannot achieve this. But with you, we can approach central banks, we can approach planning ministries. And it is actually many ecological economists that I have known over the years who have transformed the conversations in these ministries to make this kind of thinking happen together. And that's why I'm so excited to be here. And I have some tools for you as well. I will pass around a little sheet that where you can put on your email if you're interested in our newsletters that we can be in communications. You can also look at our website to see which countries are being covered, and we are always interested in collaboration. We have a lot of partner organizations around the world, and we'll be widening the partnering with institutions around the world as well. We also wrote a little booklet that I have some copies here. Some of you may have seen it already, just kind of being a little bit provocative. But I think it's not just two separate crises we are looking at. It's not just a financial crisis and an ecological crisis. We have now numbers to show that the financial crisis is basically driven by rising resource costs. And without turning around these trends, it's going to be very, very difficult to see a turnaround in the way we operate our economies. We also have another tool, we call it the Swiss pocket knife. My wife says, here she says, Swiss pocket knives, you know, they can cut Swiss cheese, but this pocket knife can cut bologna. Bologna means nonsense in English. And so you can open it, it has a warning that once you open it, you cannot close it anymore, but that's okay. I can give you a little lesson. So with that, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you again for being part of this amazing family. Thank you, Margaret Mead, to let us know that we can change the world. And together we would love to engage with a number of countries with you, because we have done it with a number of you, and with more we can get there even faster. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Wagner, for this very persuasive speech on the promotion and the adoption, implementation of ecological footprint all over the world. You have our support for the implementation at the national level. And now I invite William Hayes for his speech.
Well, thank you very much, Luciana, and to all members of the selection committee. It's a profound honor for both of us to have been selected for this award. It came right out of left field. I had no idea this was in the works, so it was an absolute delightful surprise. And it's a particular honor for me to be co-honored with Matthijs, who is one of my most brilliant PhD students. And he's already emphasized what a thrill it was to work together for the few years he was with me in Vancouver. And of course, we've had a continuing relationship over the years since then. And I have to commend him enormously for his entrepreneurial initiative in creating the Global Footprint Network with Susan and using it to such great effect in promoting this concept around the world. So my very special thanks to Matthijs as well. Now, I knew what he was going to say, so I didn't want to repeat a great deal of it. So what you're about to hear now is really quite different. First of all, how many of you got what Matthijs was all about? Okay, so it was an exercise, an exquisite exercise in logic, something that human beings are known to be capable of. I want merely to summarize, whoops, I'm holding this the wrong way, I guess, a couple of the major points. The first thing that eco-footprinting shows is that the human enterprise, that's all of us in this room, and in the aggregate around the world, exceeds right now, as we speak, the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. Now, let that sink in for a minute. Because if it's true, and we believe it is, it means we have a huge problem beyond anything people are willing to admit in the meetings down the road, or for that matter, in much of what's been going on here. The magnitude becomes obvious when we recognize that just on the basic flows of energy and material, if everyone lived the way we do in North America, we'd need about an additional 4 planet Earths to sustain current levels of consumption. So the global development track of raising everyone to the same levels of material throughput that we enjoy in North America is a mathematical and logical impossibility. It cannot happen, and so to continue discussing it at length as if it's something achievable through technological wizardry of one kind or another, even as we watch the collapse of fisheries, the accumulation of carbon dioxide, the erosion of soils, the decline of tropical forests and the spread of deserts is really a contradiction in logic. What happens when a population exceeds carrying capacity? By definition, if we are in exceedance of our biocapacity, we are consuming our capital. We are not living on the annual income generated by living biomass, but rather we are using all of that plus consuming a portion of the productive capital base. If we as ecological economists truly believe what Herman Daly has been pounding into most of the world's mind for some 2.5 decades now, that the human enterprise is a subsystem of the entire ecosphere, in other words, the economy is basically human ecology, it's one species within the ecosphere, then the growth of the human enterprise beyond the capacity of the ecosphere to sustain that growth means we are eroding the very biological basis of our own existence. Stop and think about that for a while and ask yourself if there's anything going on anywhere in the world today that actually takes that simple thing into account. So that's just background. Matisse has covered this. The bottom line is that ultimately, a system beyond carrying capacity, a system using more biocapacity than nature can replenish in a comparable period of time, is a system headed for collapse. And I must underscore, as I'll point out much later, that many, many previous civilizations have gone through this cycle and collapsed. We're the same species, and we're on the same track, and we're not paying attention to the evidence. Now, this is the Boulding lecture, so I thought it was worth raising one of Ken Boulding's most famous quotes. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Matisse started out with something very similar. Now, we can excuse the economists because we know they've always believed in fairy tales and myths, and what the hell. But there's no excuse for the rest of us. Why is it that so many other people who aren't even formally trained to think of growth as the norm believe that it is in fact the only way that we can survive on this planet? So are we madmen? And actually my answer to that is that if you define a mad person as someone who does not generally operate according to the rules of high intellect or logic, then I am afraid I have to condemn the human species to madness. That's precisely how we're acting in the world. Now, by way of conceptualizing this, I want you to think of 4 qualities of humans that make us truly unique on this planet. These are 4 qualities. There's others, but in the context of sustainability, these are the 4 things that make us stick out. We do have unparalleled capacity for evidence-based reasoning and logical analysis. I've got a bit of a cold, so I need this. There's no other species on Earth that comes close to people in expressing that ability. We have a unique capacity for forward planning. Professor Sachs talked about this in the earlier session. No other species is remotely capable of taking a look at the data, at the evidence before it today, and manipulating its own system in order to change its trajectory toward a more desirable future. An absolutely unique human quality. Another absolutely unique human quality is the capacity to make moral judgments, to know what is right and what is wrong, to know what is ethical and what is unethical, to know what degree of equity is reasonable on a planet of limited resources. We also have a quality that other species also share, but we, at least in potential, have it to a much greater degree, and that's the ability to be compassionate, to extend our empathy toward other individuals and other species in distress. Okay? So these are the qualities that make each and every one of you, and some to a more or less degree, unique on the planet. So here's the question that has been plaguing me ever since we came up with this brilliantly logical way of summarizing this dilemma. Why is nobody paying any attention? Why is the world community, particularly the rich, economically and technologically competent nations, failed utterly to reverse or even substantially slow the degradation of the ecosphere, the widening income gap, biodiversity loss, etc.? Think about it. Why is the species with those 4 remarkable qualities, with the analytic tools at our capacity, and it's not just obviously eco-footprinting analysis, dozens of other technical studies showing essentially the same thing, why are we so utterly non-responsive to the evidence in our national planning, in our local planning, and certainly in our global planning? And as a matter of fact, I loved this statement when I read it many years ago, I think in 1994. David Orr points out that it's not the ignorant people on the planet responsible for the dilemma and the decision-making, but the current global crisis in all of its dimensions, economic, ecological, and social, is largely the work of well-educated people with BAs, BScs, LLBs, and PhDs. The poor haven't caused these problems. It's those folks from the best universities on the planet going about developing the earth that have brought this crisis upon us. So there's something fundamentally not connecting here. And in case you think I'm exaggerating, let's go back to 1992. Here are the 3 framework conventions that came out of the original Rio Conference: on climate change, on biological diversity, and to combat desertification. I've drawn these graphs from a paper published just a week or 2 ago in Nature, and the authors give all of these conventions a failing grade. So 20 years later, the world community has failed utterly to achieve even a fraction of the promises put forward in these fundamental conventions. And judging from what I'm hearing going on down the road, we're going to do worse this time out. So my first premise was that humans have evolved these unique capacities. My second premise is one that I'm stealing from Theodosius Dobzhansky. I'm a biologist, so I'm falling back on my evolutionary roots here. He famously said that nothing in biology makes sense except as interpreted in the light of evolution. Now, one thing that ecologists and biologists have long argued is that humans forget that they too are an evolved species. We are primates. We think of ourselves as the most superior example of the evolutionary process. So if we accept that, and we accept Dobzhansky's essential assertion here, then I'm arguing that as a highly evolved species, nothing in human affairs makes sense except in light of evolution. So what I want to do now is to try to bridge this disconnect between what we know and what we do in the domain of sustainable development. My hypothesis is one that offends a lot of people. I've got various versions of this, but for this purpose, I want to simply assert that we are potentially, and in fact, unsustainable by nature today. And that is because human beings, as an evolved species, have certain genetic predispositions, behavioral predispositions, that render us incompatible with the ecosphere via the medium of technology. So here's the basic assertion: unless or until constrained by negative feedback, something that keeps us down, Homo sapiens, like all other species, will expand to fill all available habitat, and we will use up all available resources. Now just think about that. There's no other species on this planet that occupies as wide a geographic range, no other vertebrate species, as human beings. We've occupied the Earth. Matisse mentioned we've gone from an empty Earth to a full Earth in the lifetimes of some of us in this room. Will we use all available resources? Well, look at the absurd extent to which we are now exploiting, for example, fossil fuels. But it's just about every other resource essential to our economy as well. And we're not as limited as other species because our technology enables us to go for deeper and less well-concentrated ores and so on and so forth. With each advance in technology, we simply express this inherent predisposition to use all available resources. Now, even those illustrations aren't enough for some people. How many of you have a credit card? How many of you are running a little balance from month to month on your credit card? Now, be honest. Okay, there's an honor. Okay, so your income is a resource flow. You use it all up. So we invent another thing called credit, and we continue to use that up. We are inherently predisposed to using all resources at our disposal unless countered by negative feedback. And here's the fundamental reason for this, again, from basic biology. Humans are a classical example of what is called a K strategist. Our reproductive strategy makes us a species that will always press up against carrying capacity, the limits to resources and the limits, in this case, to the finite planet. A typical K strategist, K simply means carrying capacity. A K strategist will always press up against carrying capacity. They're characterized by being large, long-lived, slowly reproducing organisms that have a high degree of parental care, therefore very low infant mortality, high survival of offspring, and so on. So we are characteristic, in fact, quintessential K strategists. This was Malthus's insight, by the way, long before the science of K strategy was developed. And here's the obvious outcome. Notice the shape of this curve, the theoretical curve, the exponential growth curve. The actual population growth curve begins to level off, and if you look at this curve, that's exactly what we're seeing. The human population growth curve is beginning to level off, as everyone tells us. But there's a number of things to take from this curve before we move on. The first is that we could extend the x-axis for 50, or let's say 200,000 years to the left. And what you would then notice very clearly, it's clear enough here, is that for 99.9% of human history, growth was not an issue. There was no growth. There was no growth of sufficient scale in the lifetime of a human being for any person to notice. Okay? It has only been in the last 200 years that growth is a real phenomenon characteristic of our population. And that's because we removed the negative feedback of disease, famine, resource shortages, and so on through the use of fossil fuel. So again, it's a perfect illustration of that fundamental biological reality that unless or until constrained by negative feedback, we will explode. Remove the negative feedback, we exploded. The human enterprise is a product of fossil fuel. And to the extent that it's dependent on energy, we've got a huge problem if energy supplies peak, as indeed some say they have, certainly conventional petroleum has, and as prices make energy increasingly scarce for a larger and larger number of the world's people. It's precisely why food prices doubled a couple of years ago and are now well on the track once again. So the serious use of fossil fuel, beginning really just 150 years or so ago, is largely the reason behind this explosion. And I must underscore that only 5 to 7, perhaps 8, if you want to stretch this, generations of people out of thousands have experienced growth in their lifetimes sufficient to notice it happening. Yet everyone in this room is part of one of those generations. So what we take to be the norm is actually representative of the single most anomalous or abnormal period in the history of our species. In any other species, we would call this the plague phase of that species' development and occupation of its habitat. And it's not just petroleum abetting population, it's everything else. This paper a couple of years ago showed that virtually everything human beings do and use has a curve of similar shape. Beginning about 1750, and by the way, most of this development happened in the last 50 years. We've used half of all the oil ever used in the last 35 or 40 years. And we'll use twice as much again if we had it in the next similar period. The second part of my hypothesis, and that was the biological component, is that we are unsustainable by nurture. So humans are obviously a biological species, but we're also a cultural species, and there's always that tension between nature and nurture. But this is one area where nurture and nature have come together, and our careless nurturing has reinforced our biological predisposition. People have genetic predispositions, but we also have what are called mimetic or memes, nuggets of cultural knowledge that influence our evolution that can be passed on between generations or even within a generation, which affect the progress of that species. So the growth paradigm is an example of a cultural meme. The growth ideology, or the whole neoliberal economic ideology is another cultural meme complex. I guess it was Schumpeter who once talked about the pre-analytic vision that economists brought to bear on problems as determining the outcome. And these were tremendously powerful insights, because each of these paradigms or ideologies or pre-analytic visions is a social construct. It's a product of the human mind that doesn't exist in nature, but which nevertheless has an enormous influence on the way in which the human enterprise develops. So we're currently in the thrall of a socially constructed myth of continuous growth and technological progress, best expressed, I suppose, by Julian Simon. We have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years, a wonderfully modest statement of human. But we're already witnessing the enormous effects, particularly in North America, of the purposeful construction. Listen to my words. We are doing this on purpose, or at least some subset of our population is. The construction of a new age of unreason, an anti-enlightenment philosophy, which is anti-science, anti-intellectual, anti-evolution, anti-just about anything that involves the 4 qualities I suggested earlier are the unique qualities of human beings. So we have politics dominated by a neoliberal ideology, increasing religious fundamentalism in many parts of the world, featuring climate change denial, anti-intellectualism, and other forms of what I simply call magical thinking, because they have no evidential base in reality. Now, again, I ask you in your minds to contrast these emergent phenomena, which are purposefully created social constructions, against our potential to respond to the data that I spoke about earlier. Now, I want to get to the core of this middle presentation. How can this be? How can a species, the self-proclaimed evidence of intelligent life on Earth, act like a complete, utter, bloody moron? And it has to do with the evolution of the physical structure of the brain. Now, the first real insight into this came with Paul MacLean's description of what he called the triune brain hypothesis, that the human brain has evolved in great leaps, that we started out 200 million years ago with the reptilian brain core. Very simple brain, that's where our instinctive responses are. Some of our sexual responses, the fight or flight response, and so on and so forth. To that was later added what he referred to as the limbic system, or the mammalian midbrain, and that's the seat of emotions. And finally, humans, more than any other species, acquired the cerebrum, or the neocortex, the new brain. Most people, it constitutes about 66% of the brain by mass. And that's the part of the brain in which logic and reason, forward thinking and planning, language and speech resides. So the human brain is an evolutionarily very complex organ. It acts as a completely integrated system with emotions affecting thinking, thinking affecting emotions, instinct affecting both of the other. But the problem is, we never know at any point in time which of the various qualities of the brain is really in control. Now, MacLean's ideas were a bit off. He erred about evolutionary sequences in some places. He erred about the exact location of certain brain functions. But he got the functional relationships and the tensions within the human brain just about right. So that in recent experiments in human evolutionary psychology and neurobiology, here's a wonderful summary statement in an article in the New Yorker a few years ago. A bevy of experiments in recent years suggests that the conscious mind is like a monkey riding a tiger of subconscious decisions and actions in progress, frantically making up stories about who's in control. Now his point is, and again, many of you will find this completely dumbfounding, but many of the things that you think you are deciding in your conscious mind have already been decided subconsciously. The subconscious then allows you to think that you've made that decision at a conscious level, and you get away with that kind of thinking. So the point is then, we are very much a conflicted species. We live in our cerebral consciousness. By definition, we can't be aware of what's going on below in the subconscious. So we think everything important that we do and say comes from that conscious part of the brain. In fact, what the psychology is showing us is that most of it originates deeper down and is motivated more by the instinctive and the emotional dimensions of our neurological system than elsewhere, than in the cerebral cortex. Now, particularly important, and this is at the core of my argument, when anything from simple comfort to safety or survival, so these are all emotionally loaded things. People don't want their comfort disturbed. They certainly don't want to be unsafe. They want to survive. So these things are all on a spectrum of possibilities. But when any of those things are threatened. And within that category, I want to include personal prestige, your hard-won socioeconomic status, political power, anything, in fact, that has to do with a comfortable status quo. When these things are threatened, then the innate behavioral propensities that operate beneath consciousness in the midbrain and in the reptilian brainstem override your active judgment. How many of you have ever gone to a all-you-can-eat smorgasbord and found that I will just have one plate, and you go up and you have that. 3 minutes later, you haven't even thought about it, but you're up there again refilling that plate. Or you swear you're not going to have that one more peanut, and you wind up eating half the bowl. Well, you see, you have a subconscious predisposition to devour sugars, fats, and salt. And if it's there in quantity, you will eat it. And that's why there are 1 billion people on this planet who are chronically obese, even though it's against intelligence, logic, morality, and a dozen other things. It's there, we will use it. So it all connects back to our propensity to overuse resources. But the bottom line here is that despite those intelligent qualities, those qualities that reside in the cerebral cortex, despite the fact that we are more conscious of them than of anything else, the passion and instinct, the emotive urges that come to us from our reptilian brain stem and the limbic system override our intelligence much of the time. Passion and instinct trump reason. This is the most perfect editorial cartoon I've ever seen. It simply illustrates exactly what I'm saying. Picture a Chamber of Commerce meeting. They've invited the head of Imperial Oil or something to speak to them. And so, while it is true, as our science tells us, the end of the world scenario is rife with unimaginable horror, we believe the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunity for profit. And that's the perfect illustration of the conflict between our struggle for moreness, for greater social achievement, for more economic power, for more political power, in conflict with our intelligence that tells us that to exploit this in these circumstances is an absurdity. Now, I'm getting close to the end. I know you're getting very nervous about all of this, but it gets worse. I want to just explore 2 levels at which we're picking this all apart and can begin to understand it. we're now able to detect very accurately patterns of neurological activity that are stimulated by key words in the human brain. People can be wired so that we can literally almost watch a television show of what's going on in their headspace. And hundreds of experiments now have been conducted to show a spectrum of brains. See, in evolution, all evolution needs is a great diversity in a large population where that diversity is genetically related and can be passed on to the next generation. This enables natural selection to operate on the qualities found in that diverse population. So we have a spectrum of mental capacities that we can kind of put on two poles like this. One pole, or one brain type, is relatively closed-minded. It's uncomfortable with novelty. It is likely to oppose radical new ideas. It prefers black and white solutions. And people with this type of brain are very unlikely to change foundational beliefs that they've acquired in the course of their personal development. They are more likely to seek out ideas that reinforce their existing beliefs, and they are more prone to deny reality. They tend to be more hierarchical, authoritarian, and individualistic. People, they think, are on their own. There's not much of a sense of community here. You're responsible for yourself. At the other end of the spectrum of brain types are people who respond to ideas that show them to be more open-minded, more flexible and curious, more comfortable with uncertainty, more nuanced in their thinking. I misspelled that, I see. More likely to change their beliefs and to accept more realities. So you can see quite a spectrum here from fairly rigid to fairly flexible and adaptive. These folks are likely to be moved by evidence-based reasoning. Probably most of us in this room fit over on the right-hand side of this graph more than on the left-hand side. Tend to be more relaxed about authority and social order, more disposed to community and collective values. I've insisted all along that sustainability is a collective problem, needs collective solutions, cooperative solutions, right? People are responsible for each other. That's what it means to be part of society. Now, the point is that these two poles, as it were, are now very well described in a wonderful new book by Christopher Mooney, called, get it, The Republican Brain, the Science of Why They Deny Science. The Republican Brain, the Science of Why They Deny Science. And he's basically taken much of this literature and put it together to explain what has emerged in North America recently in the form of the denialist movement. But operating under it is another neurological trick that is much better known, and now I think profoundly important in the game that we're playing here with the planet. It turns out that individual development, their sensory experiences and cultural norms during the course of individual development, repeated sensory experiences, repetition of cultural norms. Remember the paradigms, they can be disciplinary paradigms, academic paradigms, political ideologies, and so on. When you hear these repeated frequently and enough, they literally create synaptic circuits in the brain that tie together this complex of ideas associated with that particular complex of ideas. So your experience determines how your brain literally develops. Subsequently, once you have a set of thinking in place, as it were, people tend to seek out experiences that reinforce their pre-existing sets of belief, and we tend to deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget information that is contrary to our pre-existing sets of beliefs. So look at the conundrum we have. This mighty brain with the capacity for these high intellectual powers, but at the same time, it's not all equal, it's not a blank slate. Some of us are more predisposed to very conservative behavior, some to very liberal behavior, but in any case, our cultural context can ingrain in the brain neural circuitry that then filters out incoming information. The way people with different brains, the way people with different cultural experiences interpret new information differs widely depending on the pre-existing neural circuitry in their heads. Now, we've known about this, we've known about the phenomenon, if not the mechanisms, for a very long period of time. A wonderful book you can download from the internet was written by Gustave Le Bon back in 1896. The masses, it's full of wonderful quotes like this. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error. In other words, once you have a fixed pattern of behavior and you're in a comfortable mode of existence, don't bother me with the truth. I want only to hear that which reinforces my current state of being. If we leap ahead a century or so, Derek Jensen, a young American philosopher activist, wrote much the same thing. For us to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other, and especially to ourselves. The lies are necessary because without them, deplorable acts would become impossibilities. That's what's going on down the road here in Rio Plus 20. A bunch of nations telling lies to each other to protect the status quo. Again, this stuff is so well documented without the underpinning psychological explanation I've laid out for you. Back in 1984, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historical book was written called The March of Folly. Barbara Schuchman, one of the US's top historians, describing what I'm now saying is a universal and persistent problem. And it's universal and persistent because it's a fundamental dimension of human nature. And again, Le Bon, not truth, but error is the chief factor in the evolution of nations. Tuchman's, I think, the most powerful statement in the book, in summarizing what she's trying to say, is this one. Wooden-headedness, the source of self-deception, which is what she's talking about, plays a remarkably large role in government. It consists in assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions, while ignoring any contrary signs. It is acting according to wish, while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. And I ask you again to assess what is going on in these negotiations in this light and against the facts. Here's the US, a statement by George Monbiot just a day or so ago about the current US negotiating position in this meeting, and put it in the context of what I've been saying to you. The US is negotiating to leave out the word equitable. This must be cleansed from the text. So must any mention of the right to food, water, health, or the rule of law, gender equality, and women's empowerment. So must a clear target of preventing 2 degrees of global warming. Oh no, we can't have any of that. So must a commitment to change unsustainable consumption and production patterns and to decouple economic growth from the use of natural resources. So just about everything that this meeting has come together to agree is absolutely essential for a sustainable future is off the table, as far as the US and, by the way, the Canadian delegations at this meeting are concerned. So again, we really have to ask ourselves, going back to one of my earlier slides, are we really evidence of intelligent life on Earth? So let me wrap up. Joseph Tainter is a scholar who has studied the collapse of complex civilizations. He has a simple theory. He argues that societies, 2 minutes. Now, 2 minutes. I've just finished the introductory comments, so I'd like to try to... Okay, human societies are problem solving, but problems get more and more expensive to solve, diminishing returns. The world today is full of diminishing returns in energy, in medicine, anywhere you look. More and more investment results in less and less output. So this is what happens. Society grows to a point where diminishing returns results in disillusionment, and the society goes down. He's documented it in 25 or 30 societies. Joseph Tainter looks at collapse from a slightly different perspective. Tainter looks at it from an anthropological perspective. Jared Diamond is more ecologically oriented, and he sees, oops. Oh, we don't need to worry about that. Jared Diamond talks about the environmental elements, damage people inflict on their ecosystems, climate change, loss of contact with trading partners, and so on and so forth. If you look at these qualities, they're all extant in the world today. A more general theory that brings it all together is panarchy theory, credited to, I guess, Crawford Halling more than anyone else. This is his recumbent figure 8 theory. It shows that many systems in nature at all spatial and temporal scales go through repeated cycles. Think of seasonal cycles, the cycles of life and death. Economists talk about business cycles and so on and so forth. So there's a period of growth and exploitation, followed by rigidification and conservation, which leads to brittleness and collapse, which releases resources so the whole system can cycle through again. Now, humans are highly resilient. Our technology does one thing, and one thing only, in the context of growth, and that is to extend that exploitation and growth phase further and further into the future, so that when collapse comes, it's ultimate and enormous, which is an extremely dangerous thing. If we really want to be resilient, then we would use our energy to stall the system somewhere partway up the exploitation and growth phase before we get to the brittle conservation phase. So could our now you see, we have both maladaptive genes, those expansionist tendencies I talked about, and maladaptive cultural memes. Neither can survive on a finite planet. Can they therefore be selected out by nature gone wild, which is what we're threatening? Tainter says, probably. What is perhaps most intriguing in the evolution of human societies is the regularity in which the pattern of increasing complexity is interrupted by collapse. We're on that course. These are the real data. Okay, I'm done. Real data plotted against the Limits to Growth book of the 70s. It shows that everything that's happened in the 30 years following the publication of Limits to Growth is exactly what they said would happen. And it's too bad if this falls out, because Fred Hoyle said, if the human civilization collapses, it's a one-shot affair. We will have used up all the resources, all the easily available energy, and so on and so forth. So no species, however competent, could follow in human footsteps on a planet dissipated and depleted by the thermodynamic laws operating with the results of human enterprise. Boulding gets the last word. We're growth bound. He simply argued that the troubles of the 20th century are not unlike those of adolescence. Rapid growth beyond the ability of organizations to manage, uncontrollable emotion, and a desperate search for identity. Out of adolescence, however, comes maturity, in which physical growth, with all of its attendant difficulties, comes to an end, but in which growth continues in knowledge, in spirit, in community, and in love. And it is in this that we must look forward to as a human race. And if we don't, you can see the consequences. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for laboring all of this.
We thank you very much for this deep study, reflections on the human behavior, human brain, this dramatic picture that you showed us. And now I would like to know if you have a few minutes for short question. One question.
One question.
Wow.
Just a very quick question. I want to ask Bill how to apply all of the insights of your lecture to solve the global crisis, because maybe the answer would be too long, but if you could do that shortly, fine. But also a question for Dr. Walker-Nagel, and that is, the ecological footprint is also often criticized as a good way to conceptualize something, but not necessarily scientifically rigorous. I'm wondering how we fight that criticism of the ecological footprint. Thank you.
Yeah, so to pick up on that, be skeptical. Go do your own analysis. If the results are different, let us know about it. You'll find that they won't be, for the most part. Now, going to your question, the first thing we have to do is know ourselves. You know the term physician, cure thyself? The very nature of these neurological problems is that they operate beneath consciousness. So the first thing we have to do is to have a conversation about what it is that motivates us, even at these kinds of meetings. Nobody's being honest. When you're dealing with this kind of problem, you have to have a heart-to-heart, face-to-face around the fact that we're all in this sinking boat together, but we're being motivated by primitive, instinctive survival things that worked well when we were tiny tribes in the jungle, but have no place whatsoever on a planet that's in the state of affairs that we're in today. So it's a question of raising this to consciousness, so that if you just got two world leaders to come out, China, say, and the United States, and said, look, you know what, we've been screwing up, we've got this thing all wrong, this is what we've got to do. This is a collective problem requiring collective solutions. We need a global institution to begin to draw together the policy platform that will enable us to slow this ship down before it goes down. But until we get that kind of nugget of conviction from real leadership, which is not anywhere on the planet today, I see the kind of meeting we're witnessing down the road here take us down the road to fatal despair, because it's going to be everybody for him or herself in a resource-scarce world that was depicted in Matisse's, I think, second slide. And if that's what you want, that's where we're headed. Thank you again.
Warm applause.